One human. That's also another profound genetic statement, because that means that all of your genetics have to fit into Adam. Ooh. Can we have black people and white people and Chinese people all in Adam? Well, let's hope so. 1,600 years after that scene, we have a man named Noah and his family, Genesis chapter 9. The sons of Noah that went forth of the ark. After the flood, they're coming out of the ark. Or Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them the whole earth was overspread. Is it true that everyone on earth today descends from that family alone? Ooh, that's only 4,500 years ago. The average human generation time is about 30 years. That's only about 4,500 divided by 30, about 150 generations ago. That's not a lot of time. Are you still comfortable with this? Genesis chapter 11. The whole earth was of one language and one speech, and they said, "Go to, let us build a city and make a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name." And God said, "Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. The Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon all the earth." And this is the time of a man named Peleg. This is about 5 generations in that lineage after the flood. So Shem, Ham, and Japheth, their families were completely intermingling. One language, one culture, no rules about who you can marry and who you can't marry. And then God separated the world population, according to Y chromosome. According to the man, according to the male ancestry, not the female ancestry. Remember the first thing, when I started working with John Sanford, straight out of graduate school, he hires me to do some genetic analysis. He goes, "Okay, Rob, I want you to take the mitochondria and compare them to the languages. They should match up." And they absolutely didn't match up. It's a complete disaster. It's like, this didn't work. Wait a minute. The Bible doesn't say that God separated them according to the female ancestry, the mitochondria. It says separated according to the male ancestry. And that's why the female lineages are totally scrambled across the world. Now, I need to show you that I'm a geneticist. I started off just with a degree in biology from Georgia Tech. I decided I wanted to go study coral reef ecology, so I went down to the University of Miami to their PhD program, and I'm studying corals. And I'm doing lots of scuba diving. It was really hard. And I ended up in the genetics lab. See, I was studying these animals' coloration patterns, just trying to figure out, because ecology is a very soft science. They don't want to tell you that. But, I'm studying coloration. What does it even mean? I don't know. I never figured it out what these colors are for. But I was doing chemical extractions, and nothing was working. I could not pull the pigment out of these animals until I did an extraction for proteins. Their proteins are fluorescent. I'm made of protein. I don't glow under a black light. What on earth? Well, once I realized there's proteins there, I realized there's genes behind the proteins. And when I stole the genes that code for these bright green and bright red pigments in these animals and engineered them to these animals, that's when I got my doctorate. So my doctorate's really in genetic engineering. And that opens up a giant can of worms, which we'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow. But I was comfortable with this, basically because my laboratory, we were trying to work on cancer models. We're trying to get that gene in the fish next to a cancer gene, so when it got cancer, it would turn green, and when we cured it would stop being green. That's a lot better than working on human embryos. Right. So the moral implications here is I don't care how many fish I kill. If I can save a single human life, it would be worth it. Just saying. But I know that's a huge can of worms. Now, since then, I've published a lot. I managed to publish several things as a creationist in the evolutionary literature. Like John and I realized years ago that even though they talk about mitochondrial leave all the time, no one had ever actually said, what is mitochondrial sequence? So we calculated it and we published it in Nucleic Acids Research, an evolutionary journal. A couple years later, we're studying influenza virus, and we published this thing about mutation in the influenza virus. So I am a practicing geneticist. Now, I don't do genetic engineering anymore. This is my laboratory right here. I have a file with 120,000 SARS-CoV viruses. I've got one with 54,000 human mitochondria right here on my laptop. I have a spare drive with the Human Genome Project and the Simon's Genome Diversity Project and the 1,000 Genomes Project. What I do is I write computer programs and I analyze data for fun, because I'm a nerd. And it turns out there's some low-hanging fruit the evolutionists are not looking at. And when we can identify that, because they're not thinking about it, say, wait, you never studied that? Boom, I can publish it. By the way, it's a great example of creationism. This actually contradicts your evolutionary stuff. Maybe that's why they're ignoring it. But it's now impossible for me to publish in evolutionary journals. I'm too well known. So be it. Now, besides science and besides genetics, I'm also a huge history buff. I love reading about history. I listened to a history book on the way up here. Ran out of that book. I listened to all my history podcasts. History is amazing. You know what genetics is? It's the science of history. It's the science of how things are passed from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And genetics is a toolkit for studying and testing models of history. Well, the Bible is a science book and a history book. And it claims, a science book in that, it claims to make big genetic things, which I talked about in the very beginning. It's big genetic statements in the beginning of the Bible. And it's history. Well, are they true or not? And can we test them with modern genetics, and do we dare try? Of course we should try, but we have to be careful. Because just like the example with the mitochondria and the languages that didn't work, if our understanding of the Bible is incorrect, we might conclude the Bible's wrong. We better be very careful here. But I'm also a genealogist. I love genealogy. I've been studying my family history for 30 years. You know what that is? That's the world's most luxurious cruise ship lying on its side. This is the SS Normandy. In outbreak of World War II, the French sent it to America so the Nazis wouldn't get it. And the Americans were converting it into a troop transport to bring soldiers to England for the invasion, interestingly, of Normandy. Well, I show the picture because my great-grandfather was on that boat when it caught fire, and he was burned. He survived. He was commended for running in and out of the ship, carrying burning men and saving them, and boiling hot tar dripped on his head and on his back. So he couldn't work as a longshoreman anymore. He ended up being a New York City cab driver the rest of his life. My great-aunt, her only phrase was, he was a mean old coot. I just like having that background in my family. But if you start here and you drive in the street of Brooklyn, just not very far, a couple of miles, you see this beautiful row of brownstones. Now, I took this picture. I took this picture because I have this picture of my grandmother next to her grandfather, who's an immigrant from Friesland, the northern Netherlands, who immigrated and built this row of brownstones. So my family contributed some of the most iconic blocks of architecture in America. And the other part of my family was a longshoreman. How did these two sides meet? I don't know. Here's another branch of my family. This is my great-grandfather, Torkel Torkelson, who was born in Norway. Next to him is Lizzie Gorman. She was born in a slum in New York City. Her parents are Irish potato famine immigrants. This little girl is a second girl named Jenny. She's also not going to make it to the next census. He's dying of tuberculosis. These two boys are going to die of tuberculosis. These three sons are going to survive, and there's my grandfather. His middle name is Edwin, after Edwin Gould, the railroad tycoon, one of the wealthiest men in the world. You ever hear of the creature from Jekyll Island called the Federal Reserve? They're living on Jekyll Island. He had gotten a job as a head carpenter for this island, and they were hobnobbing with the richest people in the world. And, my grandfather's middle name is Edwin. In fact, my cousin was Torkel Edwin Torkelson, and he went down to the courthouse and changed his name to Eddie. Oh, well. After my great-grandfather died, my great-grandmother moved back to New York City and was a very poor, indigent widow. I love stories like this. But I can't go any further back in my own family. I can't go further back than that. There's a wall there. Because I don't have pictures. In fact, I found some pictures when my dad's mom died. There was a shoebox in her closet with pictures on metal. And they're not labeled. So the story dies. Well, okay, I am a nerd, and I also love geography. And so you give me genealogy, geography, and of course I'm going to draw lines on Google Earth where all my people are born, where all their people are born. So this is where I come from. Okay, look at me. What area of the world do my ancestors come from? Is it obvious that I come from Northern Europe? Is it? Yeah. How can we do that? How can we look at a person and say, oh, I know exactly where you come from? How can you do that? And how do these so-called races arise in just a few thousand years, literally 100 generations? How? Well, now we have DNA. And looking at my DNA, sure enough, 23andme.com pegged it. I knew exactly the town where my great-grandfather was born in southern Norway, and that's where my DNA comes from. I know where I come from in England. I know where I come from in the Netherlands. I know where I come from in Germany. And my mom and dad have actually had their DNA done too. My mom is from Southern Ireland, and my dad's DNA is from Northern Ireland. I'm actually half Irish because I have like 6 or 8 different Irish potato famine immigrants in my family. So DNA can tell us where we come from, but only to the country level. The Irish, I'm sorry, they weren't there 2,000 years ago. They got invaded. Scandinavia wasn't settled by white people, if you would, until pretty late in history, probably the Roman times. As these warring tribes are spreading out and they're sweeping across Asia, they're sweeping across Europe, and they got rid of the Romans. In fact, that was a really cool book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. It's about the Irish missionaries going to Europe to convert the Goths to Christianity, or we would not have these Gothic cathedrals. Cool story. And looking at my cousins on 23andme.com, looking at all the people related to me, I charted where these people are related to me on each chromosome. And I got tons and tons and tons and tons of people related to me. But you know what? Most of these people actually aren't related to me. We just share a piece of DNA from the distant past that just happened to randomly appear in me and some other person. So you can't use your family stories to go back to Adam and Eve. You can't use genealogy to go back to Adam and Eve. You can't use genetics to go back to Adam and Eve. Everything devolves, if you would, into just statistics. And we have European-ish DNA, we have Asian-ish DNA, we have African-ish DNA. But shockingly, the Africans, the Europeans, and the Asians are like 99.999 something percent identical. That's not supposed to be true, but it is. We can also bring Neanderthal man into the picture. Because now that we've sequenced DNA from Neanderthal man, warning, they can't be as old as they say, or the DNA would not be there. Do we have any chemists in the room? You want to talk about how fast DNA breaks down? Fast. And yet there's DNA in those bones. They're not hundreds of thousands of years old. They're not tens of thousands of years old. Put that aside. Neanderthal man is also fully human. So no longer they depict him with both knees bent to make him look more like a monkey. No longer do they depict them with their mouths sticking out in the bottom to make them look more like a monkey. In fact, their brains are bigger than ours on average. They had fire. They had medicinal herbs. They sailed across oceans. They got to islands in the middle of the Mediterranean that were never connected to land, and they lived there. They dove underwater to get shellfish that live not at the surface. They painted the caves. They had musical instruments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are human beings. So who are they? They're the first people to get up into Eurasia after Noah's flood. They lived there in a very harsh environment called the Ice Age, which was caused by Noah's flood, which lasted a few centuries. And as the ice melted back, other people started moving in. And those other people that moved in didn't look like you and me. The next batch of people that lived in Europe, from all the DNA, and we have now dozens, maybe even hundreds now, of their skeletons we pulled DNA out of, uniformly, dark skin, dark hair, and blue eyes. Oh, that's weird. And yet, Europe was covered by people that look like that. According to we don't have their faces, we have their DNA. And we see genes like that in people today. They have dark skin, dark hair, and blue eyes. And there they are all over Europe. And yet they intermated with the Neanderthals because Neanderthals are humans. And so we have Neanderthals, 100%. Other people move in, interbreed with Neanderthals, or intermarry, I like that better, with the Neanderthals. And so some of the Neanderthal DNA is there, but they're not Europeans yet. You know where the Europeans came from? Turkey. The people that started developing farming in Turkey or Anatolia they call it, they started moving up into Europe. In fact, some of them came up the Danube, up through the east, and some of them went across the Mediterranean and came up through Spain and France. And when those two groups met, they're genetically different from each other. We can tell from their DNA that, oh, that's the eastern group, that's the western group. And they're genetically different from the other people that they live side by side with for centuries. There's more differences between these new group of people with farming and the people that were there before than there currently exists between Europeans and Neanderthals. Sorry, didn't mean that. Europeans and Chinese. So two of the classic races are less different than the people living side by side in Europe that merged to become the Europeans. What's a race? Not only that, though, the people, that merging population, that only represents about 30% of modern European DNA. They're not really Europeans yet. Where are the Europeans? They're out in the grasslands of Asia, north of the Caspian Sea. You ever see one of those National Geographics where they had this big mound out in this big grassy area? It's called a kurgan. And they dig through it and they find a horse. And they find a king with a sword and maybe a pot or maybe some gold beads, right? You know, the Scythian warlord sort of thing, right? That Scythians a little later in history. But this is where the Europeans are living. We pull DNA of that. It's like, whoa, that's a European DNA. But this ain't Europe. We hadn't invaded and taken it over yet. And we did. There's something in archaeology. It's called the Yamnaya Cultural Horizon. There's a very interesting thing from that central region, the pots, the pottery, the arrows, the carts, all these things of similarity. They spread out. And guess what? They also brought the Indo-European languages, which is why there are words in Polish that are very similar to words in Hindi, because it's the same root language. And we can see it in the genetics. This is where the Europeans came from. So you, European, I'm talking like this because I don't see any African Americans in the congregation. I would talk differently if there's someone, actually, a lot of you have African American ancestry and probably don't know it. Do you know what happened after the Civil War to all the light-skinned blacks? They moved into cities and disappeared and pretended that they were white. Why would they want to pretend they're black? And a lot of people today who would have no idea. You look at their DNA. What's that? There's so many. All right, all rabbit trails from here on out. Here we go. One of my favorite stories is a story called "The Man Who Stole Himself." There was a slave on one of the plantation islands from Denmark in the Caribbean. And it is rumored that his father was the main organist in his big church in Boston, who basically changed American music to make it very German and rigorous, got rid of all the Celtic influence. And he had visited this place, and well, the slave girl in the house got pregnant after he left, and she named him the name of the guy who had visited. But then the master of the plantation died, and the mistress of the plantation sold the plantation and took her slave girl and the slave girl's son to Denmark, where slavery really wasn't legal. And when he grew up, he sued for his freedom and said no. And he tried to run away. They put him under house arrest. And he fought for the Danish Navy in a one-day battle with Great Britain. And he was given a medal for bravery. He said, "I'm free now." They said, "No, you're not." So he jumped on a boat and disappeared. That's in 1840s or something like that. So it comes around the year 2000-ish, and the Icelanders decide they're going to get huge into genetics, because the Icelanders, they have their church records going back to the year 1000 when that country was settled. Almost everyone in Iceland has an almost complete genealogy. And I said, let's do the DNA too. So a lot of Icelanders have had their DNA fully sequenced, and a lot of people have submitted their DNA to like 23andMe.com. Let's just look at single letters. And they're looking, what is that? Hey, that piece of DNA belongs in Africa. Turns out there's two branches of this family that descended from this man named Hans Jonathan. He went to Iceland as a half-black. He married the daughter of a shopkeeper. He inherited the shop. They had a bunch of kids, and their descendants are now living in Iceland. They were able to piece together half of that man's genome from the pieces left over in the descendants. And you can't tell by looking at them that they have an African ancestor. Slatkin and Racimo. My title, The Concept of Race is Dead. We now know. I love that phrase. You know what? When a scientist says we now know, do you know what that means?
You've been wrong.
It means I was wrong yesterday. But scientists don't like to say that because the smartest person in the room does not usually like to admit that they were wrong. That's just the way it works, right? We now know that present-day populations were created by a complex history of admixture and population movement. Although local genetic continuity over long periods has been documented in a few cases, these are exceptional. The general rule is that the ancestors of present-day populations lived somewhere else. Cool. Did I make my point clear enough? All right, let's put all this in a picture of biblical history. Forget evolutionary history. We've only got about 6,000 years to work with. You have the creation, a little bit more than 4,000 years ago. 1,600 years later, we got the flood. Now, I'm going to round off everything to nice round numbers because it actually works really nicely. Abraham lived about 2,000 BC. The Exodus was 1446, so it was really close to 1,500 BC. David literally lived in the year 1,000. He was king of Israel at the year 1000 BC. Now, of course, Jesus is at 0, and today we're 2,000 years after Jesus. You know that Moses lived in the Bronze Age? Bronze Age is not an age. It was a couple hundred years. Some place in the world skipped the Bronze Age entirely because the Iron Age invaded before they even invented bronze. David lived in the Iron Age. The destruction of Troy happened during the time of the Judges. We think that this ancient Greek history, right? No, man, Judges, this is biblical history time frame. Peloponnesian Wars, Esther's king, yeah, right in there. So we have to fit all of the things that we're saying into that time frame. We can do it, but we have to get rid of the evolutionary idea. Look at this again. There's a map of human history, according to the evolutionists, starting in Africa. But ignoring the Africa route, think of this for a second. They're saying there's been a single dispersal of people traveling through the Middle East in the recent past with one female mitochondrial ancestor into uninhabited territory. Those are all things that are directly predicted by the Tower of Babel account. That is Babel there. Now, they put the root in Africa, and in fact, they put it way down southern Africa there because they're trying to get as far away from the Middle East as possible. Diversity in Africa is really, Northeast Africa has the most amount of diversity. Well, it's not much more diversity than the Middle East itself. And so they twist this thing around as far south as they can go because they don't want to even hint that this is the biblical Eve. Imagine this instead, starting from the Middle East area, boom. Very similar picture. You know the table of nations in Genesis? Begats, the begat sections? You ever read that and your eyes cross? Oh, no way, this is the coolest stuff in the world for a genealogist. So if you look at Noah's sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham, and their sons and their grandsons, and you go all the way down in the red on the bottom as Abraham. Well, we have three main families, right? Sons of Japheth, sons of Shem, sons of Ham, right? People can draw very bad theology from that passage. You ever hear that there's three main races of people? You ever hear the phrase Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid? Yeah, those are totally politically not correct. Do not say that in public. But that is what I was taught. That was for 100 years, people are talking about these three races. It's not true. Because what do you do with the people from Kazakhstan? They look halfway between Europeans and Asians. You know what? Genetically, they are also. There's not a line you can draw on the map that separates these races. It's not there. We blend across the landscape. Consider this also, Genesis chapter 9. Right after the flood, Noah makes wine and gets drunk. Noah and his son son Ham walked in there and laughed at him. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brethren." And he said, "Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant." Therefore, many American theologians, especially before the Civil War, but shockingly even after the Civil War, Dabney would, a classic case, said that, therefore, black people are destined to be servants because God cursed Ham. Now, read that carefully. Did God curse Ham? No, he cursed Canaan. And Canaanites did not live in Africa. They lived in Canaan, we now call Israel and Palestine. There's nothing here about black people at all. And it's a very sad thing that, there's a deep intellectual tradition, specifically in the American church, that even in the North too, that teaches the Hamites are natural servants. And it is a lie. But we have this idea that the Europeans were settled by Japheth, and Ham went over to Africa, and therefore the Semitic peoples or the Middle Easterners and the Asian people. That's not true. If you just look at a map of where they lived, just look at Anatolia, Turkey. I see 3 different colors. All descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth all lived in Anatolia. And I said earlier, these people, when they invented farming, became the Europeans. So we're all descended from Shem and Ham and Japheth. Especially because between the flood and Babel, you'd expect all those 3 families to the children of Ham are going to marry the children of Japheth. Why not? Therefore, the lines do that. What doesn't mix, though, is the Y chromosome. Because that's passed from father to son to grandson to great-grandson. And when a mutation occurs, a new branch happens, and therefore we have a family tree of the Y chromosome only. And what doesn't change is the mitochondrial, it does change. It also doesn't apply to the mitochondrial genome. There's a little piece of DNA that all of us carry. We only get it from our mothers, only. Therefore, when a mutation occurs, a new branch happens in the family tree, and we can trace that back and back and back to our ultimate ancestress, Eve. So we have a Y chromosome Adam and a mitochondrial Eve. Cool. But the rest of the genome, literally 99% of the genome, is scrambled. And that's why there's hardly a difference between the Africans and the Europeans, because we're almost identical. Here's how this might work, though. Take a population with a lot of genetic diversity, and we're going to separate it into little populations at Babel. God's going to separate the nations and spread them out. Well, if you have a population like the marbles in a jar represent genetic diversity, and take a bunch of cups, maybe 10 or 12 cups, and just shake out a couple of marbles into each cup. And the marbles in each cup become the genes for the next population. Well, clearly, every population is not going to get all the genetic diversity. So the reason the so-called races appeared is because there are some genes that are found in some populations and not others. Okay, the natural outworking of the Tower of Babel account. There's another thing that produces races, though. I'm using the word race. Every time I say that, I'm thinking scare quotes, because it's not a definition of the word, right? But another way to get people that look different from each other, inbreeding. You Europeans, if you don't think you're inbred, you're kidding yourself. They estimated, someone estimated a couple years ago, every person living in England who's of English descent is at most fifth cousins from every other person in England. Because that's what happens over time. But just look at the family tree of Terah on top there. He's the father of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham married his half-sister. Well, they gave birth to Isaac, who's genetically identical to their own brother because of the inbreeding right there. Well, Isaac marries Rebekah, who's his first cousin once removed and first cousin twice removed, times 2. It's like marrying a sister. They have Jacob, who marries his first cousin Rachel and his first cousin Leah, who are much closer than cousins because of all this inbreeding. And then we have the 12 tribes of Israel down here: Joseph and Benjamin, Simeon, Reuben, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Dan. You know how you have the half of the DNA of your father and half the DNA of your mother. You know that, right? That means you have 25% of the DNA of your grandparents, right? So therefore, you have 12.5% of your great-grandparents, about 6% of your great-great-grandparents. If you take that logic and you take the longest branch here down to the 12 tribes, these guys should have about 1.5%, maybe 3% of Terah's DNA. But because they kept inheriting it under all these different ways, they've got, well, at least these brothers, not the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, but the brothers, the sons of Rachel and Leah, they're 22% identical to Terah, not 1.5%. And because of the law of genetics, there will be genes that not only are they almost identical to Terah, but all the brothers have exactly two identical copies of the same stretch of DNA. It's called identity by descent. They inherit the same piece of DNA two different ways in the family tree. Therefore, like if there's a gene for height, they have two copies of the gene, and all the brothers have the same copy. Or eye color, curliness of the hair, shape of the nose, whatever. You could literally be walking down the street of an ancient village and be like, oh, there's an Israelite. Because that much inbreeding will produce people that look different. And this has been happening in every ancient village across the world. Most people in history married someone they were related to. Someone born probably less than 5 miles away from where they were born, and very often their cousin. Very, very frequently, two cousins got married. But you know why? Because a brother and her sister would get together and say, hey, if your son marries my daughter, the land stays in the family. Oh. Charles Darwin married his cousin. Charles Darwin, his grandfather was Wentworth, as in the Wentworth pottery family. Well, his wife's last name was Wentworth. Oh. And all of her brothers and all of her sisters all married first cousins. Ooh. In fact, the British health system, they keep track of birth defects and things like that. The greatest burden of birth defects and problematic births in England are coming from the Muslim community today. Most Muslims in England marry their cousin. Still. Wow. So we get to this question now. What did Adam and Eve look like? They didn't look like you and me, but I don't think they looked like that. Or that. That beautiful woman produces almost no pheomelanin, the brownish pigment. Eumelanin, the brownish pigment. She produces plenty of pheomelanin, the reddish pigment. That boy produces tons of pheomelanin and tons of eumelanin. In fact, he is the darkest complexion that any human being can be. And he's incredibly handsome. But for decades, creation has been saying, oh, Adam and Eve, if they have to contain all the genes for all the races, well, you mix those together and you're going to get middle people, like Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans are some of the most well-mixed people on the planet because the one big island in the Caribbean where the Spanish didn't exterminate all the natives. And a bunch of Spanish men came in, and then they imported a bunch of black Africans, and the Puerto Rican population today is a mixture of 3 people from 3 different areas of the world. And they tend to have brown hair and brown eyes and brown skin. Some of them are very dark, and some of them are very light, but the average is in the middle. And I expect this is what Adam and Eve look like. All you need is God to put in a little bit of genetic diversity into Adam and Eve, just a little bit. And then add some mutations over that, like blue eyes. Oh, sorry. You blue-eyed people, I'm sorry, you have a broken gene. And it looks like it appeared once in human history because you all have a very similar section of DNA. And you inherited 2 copies of the DNA, one from your mom and one from your dad, because they both are descended from that blue-eyed person in the distant past. Just saying. So a little bit of genetic diversity in Adam and Eve, a little bit of mutation, and we have a recipe for the formation of the so-called races, especially when you have a Tower of Babel event. You comfortable with this? You know, if I try to say this in a church, probably, I don't know about this church, but a church about 50 years ago, they would have already had run me out. I'm happy that we're coming out of that, but now the damage has been done, and I'm sorry, black people don't trust you. And honestly, they've got a reason. Now, this is very uncomfortable also. This is data that was accumulated by anthropologists prior to World War II. And pretty much any anthropologist prior to World War II was a racist and a Darwinian and thought, because all the anthropologists were Europeans, that they were on the top of the hierarchy. But data should be data. And they're going around the world, and they're looking at the skin color underneath people's arms. And they have this, because that doesn't get any sunlight. That's your skin color right there. It's not tanned. And they're taking this color scale, and they're looking at the people, and they're marking the color scale, and then drew this map of the colors of skin colors around the world. That's really interesting. Therefore, dark skin is a product of natural selection, right? How come the Native Americans living at the equator in Ecuador, at 1.5 miles, 2 miles up, but they get tons of ultraviolet light? How come they don't have dark skin? What about the people in Singapore or Borneo? They don't have dark skin. Now, according to genetics, we look at the dark-skinned people in southern India or Melanesia in Australia, they have the same genetic variants. The genetic variants were in the population before we spread out. Oh. And when we look at the ancient DNA in Central Africa, Africa's not a good place to preserve DNA because it's really hot. But at a high altitude or in a cave, they're able to find some bones of ancient people. And the people in Central Africa didn't have dark skin 1,000, 2,000 years ago. They had the skin of the Khoisan Bushmen that live in the Kalahari, who pretty much have the skin tone of Barack Obama, whose mother was white. Oh. These people, the darker-skinned people in Africa, the Bantu speakers, they did something called the Bantu expansion, well known. About 1,500, 2,000 years ago, from their homeland in Central Africa, they pushed eastward and southward, and they exterminated everyone in their path, to the point where the Khoisan genes are not there in Central Africa now. So if you went to Africa in the time of Christ, it would look a lot different than it does today, because people move. When the Dutch found South Africa, they found a 100-mile wide swath of open land that nobody lived in. And they said, free land! No, the Zulus, the Bantu-speaking Zulus, had killed everyone off within 100 miles of their homeland, and the Dutch walked right into that, and then the British inherited that, and so we had the Zulu Wars. History is interesting. You can see it in the genetics. That's really cool. But, so not only are the dark-skinned genes the same when we find them, the light-skinned genes are the same also. These genes were in our population before we spread out. The genes were at Babel. This is not natural selection that produces dark skin, because it didn't happen here or here. However, ultraviolet light does break down B vitamins in the skin. Dark skin does two things. It prevents the destruction of folate. You women who have had a baby, you got to take B vitamins, right? That's folate. That's to prevent spina bifida. Well, especially African Americans. They don't have enough B vitamins. They're not making a lot of it from the sun because they have this dark skin that protects against the ultraviolet making it. Dark skin also prevents fungal infections. The more fungally areas of humans tend to be pigmented because it protects against fungus. And in fact, Central Africa is called the white man's graveyard. Thousands of Europeans in the 1800s went to Africa to spread the gospel to Africans, and they dropped like flies. Yellow fever, malaria, etc. But one other thing that killed them was things just eating their skin. It was a horrible way to go. And one missionary, the first thing they did when he arrived is they brought him to the graveyard and said, "You'll be there soon." He said, "I died the moment I got on the boat," giving his life for the Christianization of Africa. In fact, you can't talk about Africa today without mentioning Jesus, because there's so much Christianity there. It's profound. Anyway, take that little piece of mitochondrial DNA, 16,000 letters long. Throw a whole bunch of people from around the world, like I made this, and take all those sequences and put them into an evolutionary tree building program. And you're going to get what's called a phylogenetic tree. This is a story of human history. We have branches. Each branch is represented by specific letters, specific mutations that occurred at some point in history. Anytime branches come together, that's the common ancestor for all the people further on. In fact, these are people in China. Look at that. They all go back to one lady. These are the people in Europe. Oh, they all go back to one lady. These are the people in Africa. Well, they do all go back. They have longer branches, though. But I want to point out something. See, I'm group H. My group is H10. My father, though, is actually a J. He's a very rare old European mitochondria that he got from my German grandmother. But my mother, my mother's mother's mother is Frisian. Frisians are mentioned in Beowulf. They're Vikings. Ugh. But is in group H. Can you see how even that's the common ancestor? These branches are longer than these branches. These branches are twice as long as these branches. So in other words, in the same amount of time, because all these people have the same ancestor, some people picked up more mutations than others. It is clear. Therefore, you can't put your finger anywhere on this tree and know when it happened in history, because you don't know that these branches are older. They just might have mutated faster. In fact, these are the Khoisan Bushmen, the people that had the cliques in their language, that live in the Kalahari Desert. They never had a large population. Today's a tiny We're using an aberrant, strange population to define our our evolutionary mitochondrial leaf. They put mitochondrial leaf about there. You know why? Because it's halfway between the furthest point in this direction and the furthest point in this direction. The halfway point is in Africa. That's why they say Eve evolved in Africa. But they're assuming that that is actually the middle in time, and you can't know that. Look at these groups here. These people are way long, and these people are short. They all have the same common ancestor, but you can't use a clock here. So the whole clock idea is dead, therefore the African Eve is dead also. I'm going to do the same thing here for the Y chromosomes. There's a Y chromosome tree. Here again, Khoisan Bushmen, the pygmies that live in the Central African rainforest. 95% of African men belong to this group here, E1B1A. But they branch off from a group, half of whom don't live in Africa. And they branch off from a group that doesn't live in Africa. In fact, Genghis Khan was group C, the Mongolian warlord. 95% of African men branch off from non-Africans. This group didn't arise in Africa. They rose outside of Africa and then invaded. But that's not politically correct. Group O, Chinese men. Japan, Korea, most of the men belong to Group O. You see this fan pattern? You know what that is? That's a pattern you get when you have a population that just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. Populations remain small, make these spidery sort of branching patterns. Group Q, Native Americans. I am Group R1B. Group R1A, my cousins, they come from Pakistan, India. Oh, that's the Yamnaya right there. That's the east and west branch of those people spreading out. But look, that means I'm more close related to a Native American than I am to a Chinese person. Oh, this is cool. There's so much history here. But notice also, some people, again, are on very long branches that stick out from the average. That means they picked up more letter differences. That means you cannot use a clock to know how far in the past these are. But you know what this is? This pattern. That's a pattern we expect if we start with one man, Noah, spread humanity across the planet, and just let the population grow and grow and grow. That's not the pattern you get if we came from apes necessarily. You could do that if our whole population crunched down to a very small population, which the Bible says. And the evolutionists say, oh yes, we got down to an effective population size of 10,000 individuals in Africa several 100,000 years ago. They're trying to explain away the fact that that's a biblical picture. You okay with that? Your eyes are glazing over. You're getting tired. We good? All right. If you circle all the people who live where the Bible says the descendants of Ham went, you can also circle, Jewish men. Not J is not J for Jewish. That's just an accident. But most Jewish men belong to group J. Well, Jews are descended from Shem. And this pretty much looks like Japheth. I think that might be Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which means that Noah's somewhere in the middle. Now, I don't know exactly where because I don't believe in a clock. I'm not going to take the halfway point. I don't know, and I don't think you can know. But this is a type of pattern you'd expect. But if you backed up history and did it again, you get a similar pattern, but the connections between the branches will be different because mutation is random. Back it up, do it again. Back it up, do it again. They're not going to have the same exact branching pattern, but you're going to have the same picture of boom, boom, boom. That is a biblical picture right there in the Y chromosome also. But this is crazy. My father's father was William Thomas Carter. He and his father, William Thomas Carter, fled the Irish potato famine, but Carter's not an Irish name. I think my Carters came in the Elizabethan era during the plantation era when they were experimenting with how to take over a land and fill it up with English people. Yeah, that's called Jamestown also. Jamestown's a little bit after the Irish plantation era. Well, I think my Carters came then. But strangely, I share a Y chromosome with like 80% of Irish men today. And a lot of a lot of English men today also. If you look at where my Y chromosome is found across the world, it looks like this. What's a dot down in Africa? There are men that share my Y chromosome living in Cameroon. They have the darkest skin on the planet. And according to the Y chromosome tree, we're all very closely related. They're more closely related to me than other Irish men from branches I and J over here on the other side of the tree. Excuse me? Sorry, I'm going forward again here. What's a race? Those are my cousins. What is a race? I read this earlier. Darwin, if some future period not very distant. I'm going to skip over that because I already read it. Yeah, I'm good here. These two men became best friends during the Vietnam War. They're from Australia. They're fighting for the Australians in the Vietnam War. One of them is an Australian Aboriginal. The other one, obviously, is European. In fact, his nickname is Snow. I love that. So Bill Coolbera and George Snow Wilson became best friends. Later on in life, Bill developed kidney disease and needed a transplant. They could not find a transplant donor. So Bill said, "Test me." And doctors are like, "Are you stupid? Your family trees have been separated for 30,000 years. Yeah, well, here's the perfect match. And Bill was given a white man's kidney. How is it possible that for that much time they could have been a match? Well, the answer is they haven't been separated for 30,000 years. Evolution is not true. Actually, they descend from Adam and Eve and Noah just a few hundred generations ago, and they carry the same genes in both populations. Now, Luis Quintana Mercy is a famous geneticist. He says, I'm going to use the word phenotypic. That means the way something looks. Genotype is your genes, your phenotype is the way you look or act. The genes that explain the phenotypic differences between populations, in other words, Asians, Africans, Europeans, only represent a tiny part of our genome, confirming once again the concept of race from a genetic standpoint has been abolished. Hooray! That means science has finally come around. We finally rejected the Darwinian baggage, the racist baggage of the past, and they're actually coming to a more biblical understanding. But it took them 100 years. Look at Colossians 3. Where there is neither Greek, talking about inside the church, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all. Clearly saying there's no racial divisions within Christianity. How about Isaiah 59? A redeemer shall come to Zion, and unto them that turn from transgression in Jacob, saith the Lord. That word redeemer is the same word used in the book of Ruth. The Old Testament law said that someone could step into someone's place and pay the debt that they owe. So Boaz said, hey, I'll buy that piece of property from Naomi because she had sold it and spent the money. It was still her property, but she had no rights to it anymore. So he bought it. He got Ruth in the deal. All right, it's a nice bargain for him. But he was the kinsman redeemer. That idea in the New Testament, Jesus Christ is our kinsman redeemer. He paid the debt that we owe. What's a debt? Death. I'm not Jewish. How can Jesus pay my debt if he's not my kin? 1 Corinthians 15. So it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. The last Adam was made a quickening spirit. The reason that Jesus could pay my debt is because I'm related to him through Adam. Thanks be to God that there weren't people outside the garden like some theologians teach. That there weren't black people as animals on board Noah's Ark, as someone wrote me an email last week or last month at creation.com. They're soulless animals, don't you know? Excuse me? Where's the first place that the gospel went outside of Israel? Give you a hint. Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. It went to Africa a long time before it got to Europe. In fact, Lithuania wasn't Christianized until about 1200. And it was forcibly Christianized. Okay, I don't know this Christianity at all, but you get my point. Jesus was unknown in Lithuania for 1,200 years after Christ. But now in Christ Jesus, you who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ, for he is our peace, who has made us both one and broken down the middle wall of partition between us. It's talking about the Jews and the Gentiles. My Celtic and Viking pagan ancestors were disgusting. They were wicked. They were evil. They did the most barbarous, horrible things to each other. I read my own history. I'm like, yuck, these people are awful. They did not know the God of the Bible. They had no mercy. They were spiritually in darkness for a long time. How can Christ come into my life? How can I be redeemed? It's through Adam's descendant, my cousin, Jesus. Acts 17, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and had determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. Not that the races should be separate, but that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. Did you know that this genetics lecture is going to end up with a gospel lecture? I can't help it. If I wasn't talking about Jesus, I'd be wasting my time. I would not be here. I'm using the platform of science to talk about Jesus. And I love doing that. It took me a long, when I first started speaking for CMI 15 years ago, I didn't know how to put the gospel in my science talks. And now, like tomorrow morning, you'll see, it's hard to get science into my gospel talk. But there are some powerful things here. I just, without even saying it, gave the antidote to Black Lives Matter, to intersectionality, you don't even have to address those things directly. You just got to preach Jesus. Because you know what? I put myself last. I put Africa before I put Europe. It's true. It's right there in the history. I know my history. It's gross. I'm a horrible, wicked person, and my ancestors, you know what? I'm a horrible, wicked person today. If it wasn't for Jesus, I would have no hope. But isn't that what Christianity is about? About hope? About healing? About reconciliation? If we can be reconciled to Jesus, we can certainly be reconciled to an African American who's got a chip on their shoulder because of the horrible way their people have been treated in this country for a couple of hundred years. I don't blame them for that. I think they're wrong to adopt Marxism. I think it's a dead-end street and it only leads to bitterness. But it's there. And we can answer these things. But you know what? Black person, I use the word black, right? You go up to a black person and tell them that you're equal. They're going to be shocked that you said that. And just that alone can open up a conversation. You don't bow to them. They're not above you. They don't deserve anything from you. They need Jesus. And so forget, there's so much strife. Our country's being torn apart about nonsense. People need to be healed. And so, okay, I'm going to step down off my soapbox. Pick another subject. There's tons of them out there. I don't know what subject you might be interested in. Find one and dig in. Creation.com is there. Thousands and thousands of articles. The books I brought with me, the DVDs and stuff I brought with me. If you're going to ask me for recommendation, though, I'm going to recommend Creation Magazine first, on purpose. I know what this did for me when I was young, 1990 maybe, when I first started getting it. I think God studied me into Christianity through this magazine. And I can't believe I get to stand and represent this organization that blessed me so much. But we even though we own Creation.com, that's a really important piece of the internet real estate, we get more letters consistently about Creation Magazine than anything else we do. We know more people read our magazine than actually read our website. Even though our website's really popular and it's always going up in popularity, it's still very popular. This great Creation Magazine, family magazine, comes out 4 times a year. Here's what a sign-up form looks like, so I do have to explain it. Just check off 1 year or 2 year and fill in your details there. You'll notice on the back, if you turn it over, there's a place you can sign up for a gift subscription for somebody, just saying if you want to do that. So if you sign up for a 1-year magazine, you start with the magazine. We have them back there. For a 2-year magazine, though, 2-year subscription, I'm also going to throw in the digital version of our magazine, which you can read on any. I've read Creation Magazine on my phone, on a plane. It works just fine. Any digital device will work, and we let you share it with other people. For a 2-year subscription, we're also going to include Darwin, the Voyage That Shook the World. That first lecture I gave earlier was getting ready for our $1 million production of the life of Charles Darwin, called Darwin, the Voyage That Shook the World. We did this in honor of his 200th birthday. That's there. And also I'm going to throw in something called Fallout. We took a TV camera, and we went to a bunch of college campuses around Atlanta, and we interviewed several hundred students. We asked them 3 questions. Did you go to church growing up? Were you ever taught about anything about creation evolution? And do you still go to church? And wow, that opened up a whole lot of cool conversations captured on camera, and that's there if you're interested. So here's what the sign-up form looks like. All right, volunteer person, you can do that now. Thank you much. Volunteer peoples, okay. After that, the most important resource we have is that red book, the Creation Answers book. That's going to answer 99% of your questions. Like, what about dinosaurs? How can the universe be only thousands of years old if stars are millions of light years away? What about carbon dating? All sorts of questions like that we answered in one book on purpose. We have a pack called a starter pack. Comes with the Creation Answers book, and then the #1 best-selling creation evolution book ever written, Refuting Evolution. Actually, it takes a list of the best evidences for evolution the National Academy of Sciences put together and answers it using science no harder than 8th grade. That's a great book. The pack also comes with a DVD. Here's a presentation I gave in Australia in front of 700 people. Mitochondrial Eve and the 3 Daughters of Noah. It's the antecessor to the talk that I just gave, but some different information in there, some really good stuff. Or this one, The High-Tech Cell. My favorite lecture I've ever given in my life. And they happened to do it the first time I ever gave it. There was a TV camera there at our super conference, and they captured it. And at one point on stage, my head explodes. I mean, I'm talking about the technology inside the cell and how it absolutely contradicts Darwinism. It's there. And if you're interested in video stuff, on our website, we have a streaming service. Now, it's not like Netflix, like you pay $5 a month and watch whatever you want. It's a couple of dollars for each thing. But the first thing that we did is called The Historical Atom, Theological Conundrums and Scientific Implications. And it's free. And so if you go to our store and click on media, you can find my talk on basically 7 reasons to believe in the biblical atom. Some of the stuff I shared tonight, plus a lot of other stuff. But I'm going to end with this. 1 Peter 3:15. Sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of hope that's in you with meekness and fear. And I hope the stuff I shared with you tonight, those curveballs that you didn't know were coming, can be used to talk to people about Jesus. And you know what? If you're not a jerk about it, you're probably much more likely to get in a conversation. Anyway, you want to close? Thank you all.
want to echo just a couple of things. One, we were actually having this conversation just right before this talk, that when I'm studying, as I said, I've got a Sunday school class here that's all on creation evolution. We've done a lot of different things. Right now we're working our way through the whole book of Genesis. But my number one, and I mean every word of this, my number one first go-to place when I'm looking for documentation for some of the things that I'm going to be teaching or some of the things that I'm going to be doing is creation.com. Not a joke. There are literally thousands of articles on there that cost you nothing but the 10 minutes it'll take you to read the article. You need to take advantage of it. Creation Magazine, I have had since 1993. Never let the subscription drop. I have had to let other subscriptions drop over time and picked them up back later, but I've never let Creation.com drop, or Creation Magazine drop. And you need, if there's any, I was telling, I think it was just a few minutes ago, I said, Creation Magazine is the National Geographic of biblical literature. Not a joke. If you want great illustrations, great articles that'll take you right into a biblical understanding of what's going on, best magazine out there. Not a joke. Like I said, I won't tell people to not go to their church. It pains me when we're doing something like this. But if you just happen to show up tomorrow, you're more than welcome. We'd love to have you. Again, the talks tomorrow, Dinosaurs in the Bible, 10 o'clock. 11 o'clock, Creation's Competitive Edge. Why does creation make more sense? Why can we answer things that evolutionists cannot? And then last, tomorrow night, 6 o'clock, will be Evolution's Achilles' heels, plural. Come out and be with us. I guarantee you'll learn something. I guarantee you'll be edified. Take advantage of the resources that are out there. There's a lot of good stuff. I've got most of it. But like I said, I've been doing this seriously. There he is, Brother Steve. Brother Steve Falling, years ago at Eastman. We were having a, what do you do if there's a fire in the research building? And we were all gathered outside waiting for him to tell us it was time to come back in. He walks up to me and he says, I hadn't been working very long at Eastman. And he said, I hear you're in the ministry. I said, yes, sir. He said, we're having a Bible study. And he said, having it on Mondays, every Monday at lunch. We'd love to have you. I said, okay. So I started going. Now, we didn't start out with creation evolution. It was actually on something else. But when we finished that particular topic, this was the next thing. And we watched a video series, and a statement was made in that video series that changed the direction of my life, and as far as the way that I look at Scripture. And that statement was, if death happened before Adam's sin, then Christ died for no reason. And my world went, About 3 weeks later, Steve said, I'm putting in a book order. And at that time, one of the few places in the States that you could get anything was ICR. And he had this book order sheet, and he said, I'm ordering books if anybody wants anything. That's the wrong thing to say to me. I put in my order, and the first book that I read out of that set that I bought was this one right here. Still have it. But Steve's reaction was when I turned in my order sheet, did you buy everything? And I said, not quite, but I'm getting there. There's more stuff out there than you can shake a stick at. Take the time to look at the resources. Take it, and like I said, that starter pack, I've got everything in that starter pack. Like I said, that'll go 99% to answer most of the questions most people have. Grab it and growl. All right? Come back tomorrow if you can. Holy Mountain, you're expected. Everybody else, you're welcome. and it would be greatly appreciated. Come back and be with us 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Father, we love you. We do give you all the praise and all the glory for this evening. Father, how you've spoken to our hearts, and Father, encouraged us, and Father, I truly pray challenged us. Because a biblical understanding of who we are, both in Adam and in Christ, is the only hope that people have. Not just for eternity, but for tomorrow. Help us, equip us, give us peace, direction, and guidance, and we'll give you the praise. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You're at liberty to go. Don't forget the table.